Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
A car was precariously stuck on a bridge, supported by only one wheel on the edge in 1934. Without adequate side protection, many bridges posed significant risks, making accidents that left vehicles in striking positions more common. Interestingly, in the same year of 1934, another car got stuck by one wheel on this bridge, nearly falling. For the locals, the repetition of this scene was both tragic and impressive. A car was stolen by children who ended up colliding with a lawyer's vehicle, resulting in his death in 1935. The incident highlighted the rise in occurrences involving young people driving at a time when traffic laws were still being developed and enforcement was limited. An automobile fell into the Fore River in 1933, resulting in the drowning of 3 people. After the accident, a fireboat was called to pull the vehicle out of the water. Incidents like this were particularly tragic, as few vehicles had safety systems, and protective barriers near bodies of water were rare. A car stopped at the edge of a cliff, contained only by a fence in Brookline, Massachusetts, during the 1931 S. The vehicle was completely suspended at the edge of the cliff, awaiting rescue. A car lost control near the Charles River and nearly fell into the water, being contained only by a fence at the water's edge. Cambridge, 1933. Accidents near rivers were especially dangerous because they also involved drowning risks. A tragic accident took the life of John Grier Hibben, president of Princeton University, in May 1933. His car was severely destroyed due to the incident. Philip Lewitsky, a resident of Chelsea, lost his life by drowning when his car went off the road on Lynn Boulevard near Point of Pines and fell into Revere Creek in December 1930. The incident attracted a crowd of curious onlookers who watched the rescue of the man and the automobile. From another angle, the same accident at Revere Creek reveals the rescue of Philip Lewitsky and his car, with the crowd watching closely every move. The spectators crowded along the banks, a common scene in tragic incidents. Here we see only the wreckage of the car hit by a train on June 19, 1923, Beverly Hills, California, which resulted in 2 deaths. The force of the impact often left few traces of the involved vehicles. An automobile lost control and ended up submerged in a pond in 1938. This type of accident was not uncommon, as roads in natural areas often lacked safety barriers, making curves near lakes and ponds dangerous. This stolen car resulted in a tragedy, leaving 2 dead and 1 seriously injured on December 11, 1932. Accidents involving stolen vehicles were especially dangerous, as inexperienced or fleeing drivers often drove recklessly. In this photo, we see a car that nearly fell off a bridge over railway tracks, precariously balanced on the edge, in September 1930. A car was hit by a train at a railroad crossing in Belmont, California in 1933. Accidents at crossings were common, as few had proper signaling and safety was limited. This type of collision often resulted in severe damage to vehicles, and many cities began discussing ways to improve safety at railroad crossings. A car was crushed by a streetcar at the corner of Northampton and Washington Streets in 1932. Streetcars shared the roads with automobiles, and collisions at busy intersections often resulted in significant damage to smaller vehicles. A car collision occurred in Roxbury while crossing Columbus Avenue in 1931. The intersection was busy and poorly marked, typical of urban areas at the time, contributing to the increase in collisions at intersections without traffic lights. This car found itself in a complicated situation when it collided with a train car in 1935. The collision with the train left the vehicle trapped and damaged, highlighting the dangers of railroad crossings at the time, often lacking signage or adequate barriers. These crossings were risky, and accidents involving vehicles and trains often resulted in severe damage, placing drivers in high-risk situations. A car went off the bridge and fell into the water, an occurrence that, even in the old days, was not so rare. With roads and bridges lacking effective safety barriers, such incidents frequently occurred. A damaged automobile was dangerously close to falling onto the railroad tracks in Somerville, December 1929. Without protective barriers along the railway tracks, incidents like this were frequent and risky, as a vehicle on the tracks could cause serious accidents with trains. From another angle, it is easier to see the car's proximity to the train tracks. highlighting the extreme risk of a collision with a train. The automobile, already damaged, almost crossed the critical limit. With just a little more movement, the car would have crossed the tracks, potentially causing much greater damage. This out-of-control car left the road and collided with a house, stopping only after climbing a few steps of the entryway staircase in 1933. Fortunately, the vehicle did not invade the interior of the residence. An automobile went off the road and fell into a ditch at Peabody Square, a busy city point in 1931. Ditches were common on public roads, and without protective barriers, drivers often faced this kind of risk in urban areas, especially in high-traffic locations. A vehicle was flipped upside down in a canal, likely after an accident on a nearby road during the 1930s. At the time, cars were still less stable and more prone to rolling, especially under adverse road conditions or when the driver lost control. A car collided with a fence between 1917 and 1934, attracting civilians and children who observed the scene up close. With little safety infrastructure on the streets and fragile fences, accidents like this posed risks both to drivers and pedestrians who gathered nearby to watch the situation. A car accident occurred on the streets of South End, a busy neighborhood in Boston, in October 1931. At the time, the lack of proper infrastructure and the increasing urban traffic made accidents common in residential and commercial areas. Near Greenwich Park in South End, an automobile lost control in 1934 and crossed the fence next to the B&A railway tracks. With increased traffic and the proximity of roads to tracks, such accidents were risky as they led vehicles into poorly protected railroad areas. This car slid into a seemingly frozen lake in front of MIT in January 1930. Winter conditions with frozen surfaces made areas near lakes particularly treacherous for drivers. Without adequate barriers and with slippery ice, vehicles often ended up in lakes or rivers during winter, with impressive scenes like this, where the car broke the ice, attracting the attention of students and onlookers. Tragically, the man at the wheel did not survive, drowning before he could escape the submerged vehicle. The police acted quickly to attempt to rescue him, working urgently to remove the car and driver from the frozen lake. Accidents on ice surfaces were extremely dangerous, as the intense cold hindered rescue operations, and the rapid entry of water into the cabins limited the driver's reaction time in such emergency situations. Here we see that this automobile flipped over at the corner of Radcliffe Street in 1938, revealing the dangers of driving on urban roads, which at the time had little signage and uneven paving. An automobile accident occurred in front of the iconic Hotel Vendôme, a well-known gathering spot in downtown. With the increasing number of vehicles on the streets, collisions in popular commercial areas became common, especially in busy locations like around the hotel. A collision between a car and a truck occurred in the Back Bay area, a busy neighborhood in Boston, in 1932. Accidents between vehicles of different sizes were also common at the time. In Burlington, Massachusetts, a car accident occurred in October 1931. Suburban areas like Burlington were frequent victims of such accidents. An accident in Passaic, New Jersey, near the train tracks, resulted in 1 fatality and 4 injuries on March 30, 1930. Collisions near these zones presented additional risks both for those involved and for rail traffic. In an uncontrolled direction, a car ended up climbing and entering an underground stairway, sometime between 1917 and 1935. While accidents where cars invaded sidewalks and stairways were occasional, they especially occurred in busy urban areas. Amid snow in Boston, a destroyed automobile remained abandoned in the mid-1930s. Heavy snowstorms and slippery roads increased the risks, causing frequent accidents and making immediate recovery of damaged vehicles difficult. An ambulance overturned on the busy Stewart Street in Boston, Massachusetts, during the 1930s. These vehicles, essential for emergencies, often faced risks on the crowded and poorly marked streets. At the time, ambulances were heavy and less stable, which made such accidents relatively common in large cities. A car collided with a fire hydrant in 1930, creating a dramatic scene with water gushing onto the streets. A car collided at a busy intersection between Warren Avenue and West Canton Street in the South End neighborhood. The lack of proper traffic signs and the increasing traffic in urban areas in the first half of the 20th century contributed to frequent collisions at intersections like this one. A 1925 Ford Model T truck from the United States Postal Service was involved in an accident. These trucks were widely used for deliveries at the time, and with the increase in traffic and roads still under development, accidents with postal delivery vehicles were not uncommon. This car went off the road and ended up in a ditch, a frequent occurrence in areas without side protection in 1935. With few safety barriers on the roads, it was common for vehicles to lose control and end up in dips or ditches along the streets. The automobile models of the time, with much of their machinery exposed and a less suitable structure, often broke even in small or medium impacts, as shown in this photo from around 1930. Without the safety advances and technology that would come in the following decades, these vehicles were susceptible to severe damage in common collisions, exposing drivers and passengers to risks in situations that today would be considered light. The combination of snow and old vehicles often led to tragedies. In this 1926 image, a car in West Roxbury was found overturned in thick snow. The lack of traction and stability in cars of the time, combined with icy, poorly paved roads for winter, increased the risks of skidding and rolling during storms, making driving in snow-covered areas particularly dangerous. This truck flipped at the corner of Hawthorne and Brattle Streets in Cambridge in 1930. With heavy vehicles facing narrow roads and limited safety conditions, rollovers were frequent. This car flipped over on Blue Hill Avenue in April 1931. Busy and still poorly organized urban roads at the time contributed to frequent accidents, especially on wide avenues like Blue Hill. This photo records the moment when a truck slid across the sandbar in Brighton, 1929. The lack of traction and the vehicle's weight made control difficult on loose terrain like sandbars. Without specialized tires or modern traction systems, heavy vehicles faced major challenges on sandy surfaces, often resulting in scenes like this. A Brinks truck flipped over on Hammond Street in Brookline near the Country Club on May 17, 1932, and needed to be towed by another truck. The rescue operation attracted local attention. A taxi was involved in an accident on the streets of Boston in 1930, a period when the number of vehicles was rapidly increasing in the city. The mixture of taxis, streetcars, and private cars on narrow, busy streets made collisions common, especially at intersections in central areas with high transportation demand. A collision occurred on the New York River Speedway near 196th Street in Harlem, sometime between 1917 and 1934. The road, known for its intense traffic and high speeds for the time, was a frequent site of accidents. A destroyed car attracted a curious crowd in 1935. At the time, serious accidents caught public attention, as wrecked vehicles were less common and sparked interest, especially in urban areas where crowds quickly gathered around unusual scenes. One of many cases of submerged car removal in mid-1929, when vehicles that accidentally went into the water needed to be pulled out. Apparently, drivers sometimes mistook their own cars for submarines. A tour bus heading to the beach overturned in Quincy on a fateful day in 1912, injuring several passengers. The vehicle, upon flipping, ended up with its wheels in the air, resembling a flipped turtle. This type of accident was common in the early days of automobiles, when safety was not yet a priority in the design of group transportation vehicles. A completely demolished automobile was loaded onto a Boston and Maine rail car used to transport the damaged vehicle. A boy poses beside a damaged Ford, probably attracted by curiosity to see up close the impact of an accident. During this period, destroyed vehicles attracted children's attention, and scenes like this became small local events. A completely destroyed automobile remained on a street in Charlestown around 1930. Damaged vehicles often stayed at the scene for hours, attracting the attention of curious onlookers and highlighting the risks of driving and circulating on busy city streets. A tragic collision between a car and a bus occurred in 1934, resulting in serious consequences. The impact between the vehicles of different sizes and weights was especially dangerous, with the car often suffering extensive damage. Although the bus suffered less damage than the car in the collision, it did not emerge unscathed. The structure, though more robust, showed visible damage, mainly at the front. In this image, we see a car that collided with a streetlight at an intersection in 1930, a time when urban infrastructure was still adapting to increased traffic. This car collided with a light pole on Albany Street, across from Randolph Street, in September 1929. Accidents involving light poles were common in urban areas of the time, where the proximity of poles to street beds and the lack of traffic control contributed to collisions. These incidents caused local disruptions and often left parts of the street without lighting for a while. A luxury vehicle, seen in severely damaged condition on Blue Hill Avenue around the mid-1917s, draws attention. High-end cars were status symbols, but their heavy structure and lack of safety technology made them vulnerable in collisions. What remains of the front part of the vehicle shows the intensity of the impact during the incident, which resulted in 3 victims, 1 fatal and 2 injured. In this photo, captured from another angle, the overall view of the accident and the final state of the car can be seen, with the front end completely destroyed. The impact left deep marks on the vehicle's structure. A disastrous crash occurred involving 2 NY Boston route buses in Sudbury on February 14, 1939. The collision resulted in significant damage to the vehicles. From another angle, we can see the severity of the damage caused by the accident between the 2 NY Boston buses in Sudbury. The vehicles showed significant deformation, especially at the front, where the impact was strongest. Without modern traffic control systems, and with roads often poorly marked, accidents like this were tragic and concerning, especially with passengers on board, resulting in major rescue operations. An accident on Paul Revere Road in Needham left 9 injured after a collision between 3 cars, one of which is visible in the background of the image, on December 25, 1935. During this time, the increase in road traffic, even on holidays, and multiple collisions were becoming more common, highlighting the urgent need for greater control and safety in traffic. A Ford Standard was chained and lifted by a truck, possibly after an accident or mechanical problems that occurred between 1944 and 1945. This type of transport was essential for moving damaged or out-of-service vehicles, especially during the years of World War II, when restrictions and resource shortages affected even car repair and transportation services. Demolished cars were a common sight in 1932, when the United States was facing an increasing wave of automobile accidents. This period highlighted the need for changes in infrastructure and traffic laws to address the impact of the popularization of automobiles. This Ford was taken to a workshop after suffering severe damage to its body and front panels around 1931. The lack of safety systems and the fragility of vehicle structures at the time made cars vulnerable to extensive damage, even in minor collisions. In the early years of the automobile's popularity, accidents were already a part of the streets, as shown in this 1935 photo. The lack of adequate infrastructure and the inexperience of drivers contributed to frequent collisions, even at relatively low speeds. These early incidents illustrate the initial challenges of urban traffic when cities were still adapting to the constant presence of motorized vehicles. In this photo, an officer inspects a crashed vehicle in the midst of heavy snow between 1934 and 1956. Adverse weather conditions, with snow covering the roads, made driving difficult and significantly increased the risk of skidding and collisions. Even law enforcement officers faced road dangers, as shown in this 1935 image, where an officer stands next to his destroyed vehicle. Even while on duty, officers at the time were exposed to the risks of the streets, with few safety measures to protect them in case of collisions, especially on routine patrols in busy urban areas. A car accident occurred on the Fort Pitt Bridge in 1967 during a time of intense traffic in the area due to Pittsburgh's urban growth. The bridge, which connected important city roads, frequently experienced congestion and accidents, especially during peak hours when the mixture of vehicles and limited visibility and curves increased the risk of collisions. A collision between a truck and a car occurred in 1934, Accidents between vehicles of different sizes were frequent, especially in urban areas. A bus accident in Norwood, 1934, showed that despite their robust construction and the use of heavy metals, these vehicles were not immune to major collisions. Even buses designed to safely transport passengers showed vulnerabilities in accidents, highlighting the intensity of the impact on this occasion. Traveling in a snowstorm in 1935 proved dangerous for this car, which ended up on its side on the road. Winter conditions with ice and poor visibility significantly increased the risk of skidding and overturning, especially at a time with limited tire technology and few safety features in vehicles. A Ford was just inches away from falling into a water pit, with the edge of the vehicle just centimeters from touching the water, between the mid-1934s and 1956. The lack of safety barriers on roads and the construction of roads without adequate protection near bodies of water increased the risk of accidents like this. Vehicles of different models frequently faced dangers in places where infrastructure was still under development, such as pits and dips near the roads. This automobile, after a collision in 1935, took on a curious and ironic appearance. The front end, deformed by the impact, resembled a pinched nose. With the front end crushed, the car exhibited a nearly comical appearance despite the seriousness of the accident. At the time, the absence of sturdy, absorbing bumpers resulted in peculiar deformations in vehicles, which gained these unexpected faces after suffering collisions. A crowd gathered around an elegant car involved in a collision in Boston in May 1934. Luxury cars drew attention when damaged, attracting curious onlookers who closely observed the damage to the sophisticated vehicle. Firefighters were in action to extinguish the fire that consumed a damaged car in February 1929. Incidents like this, where vehicles caught fire after collisions or mechanical failures, were relatively common at the time due to the lack of modern safety systems and the risk of combustion in old cars. Firefighting teams had to act quickly to control the flames, often without the resources we have today for automotive firefighting. The image shows a junkyard from the 1970s to the 1990s with a destroyed Mercury Montego. The shattered windshield and dented hood indicate the significant damage the car suffered after an accident. Surrounded by other abandoned vehicles, the Montego is just one among many cars that, after being damaged or worn out, end up forgotten in a yard where corrosion and time take over their structures. This car was towed to a shop after a major accident resulting from a collision in 1935. The use of tow trucks for transporting damaged vehicles was essential, especially in a time when urban roads saw an increase in accidents. These shops played a crucial role in recovering automobiles, which often suffered serious structural damage due to the lack of safety measures in cars and roads. A destroyed car was transported to the junkyard, where damaged vehicles were often taken for repairs or disposal in 1935. The condition of the car, likely the result of a severe collision, indicated extensive damage that made it irreparable for use. From a side angle, it is clear to see the vehicle's damage, with the wheels crushed and the right body completely destroyed. The force of the impact is evident, with the car's structure compromised, showing the gravity of the collision. The fender, roof, and windows of the car are completely destroyed. The rear part of the vehicle, where the fender was crushed, shows significant deformation, while the dented roof and broken windows reflect the force of the impact. The deformation of the wheels and bodywork reflects the severe damage the vehicle suffered, making it irreparable without extensive reconstruction. A police officer was keeping people away from the destroyed car and the knocked-down firebox after an accident on October 4, 1969. The scene indicated the severity of the event, with the car visibly damaged and the firebox, likely part of a safety or emergency system, also affected. The police presence helped control the situation and ensure the safety of people around, while investigations and rescues were carried out. A car was completely destroyed after a collision, with the front end crushed and twisted between 1917 and 1934. Around it, several people observed the scene, probably surprised by the severity of the impact. This photo captures a severely damaged car after an accident in Boston from around 1917 to 1934. The front of the vehicle is completely crushed, showing the force of the impact. This gangster car was destroyed in South Boston, likely after a shooting or police chase in the mid-1933. Vehicles associated with crime often became targets of violent confrontations, and the impact of these incidents often resulted in damaged or completely destroyed cars. Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, and William Burnham suffered a car accident in Boston, 1935. The image shows the vehicle after the collision, with severe damage to the front end and completely destroyed wheels. The impact was so strong it caused significant deformations in the car's structure, making it unusable. A gangster's car was destroyed in Grove Hall, Dorchester, on July 11, 1931. The vehicle was likely involved in criminal activities. Incidents like this were frequent in urban areas at the time, with increasing violence and criminal group activities. From another angle, it's easier to see the deplorable state the vehicle was in after the theft. The car, already damaged during the escape or possibly a police chase, shows severe dents, with parts of the exterior completely destroyed. A stolen car was destroyed in an accident on Center Street in Jamaica Plain. The vehicle suffered severe damage during the collision, likely resulting from an escape attempt or reckless driving. The city of Conway, Arkansas, was hit by a devastating tornado that caused massive damage to the city in April 1965. Cars like the ones shown here were spun and overturned by the intense and swirling winds of the tornado, which hit the city twice that night. In this image, an automobile appears severely damaged, likely the result of a head-on collision with another vehicle or possibly with a power pole between 1917 and 1934. The lack of protection devices in cars of the time greatly increased the severity of head-on accidents. Here we see a Ford Standard, which stopped in a rather peculiar way, balancing only on its two right wheels. The Ford, likely severely damaged, now seems challenging for rescuers and attracts curious onlookers with its unusual stance. This image captures a car that was destroyed on a snow-covered road, with the snow covering the damaged vehicle, in mid-November 1967. The lack of modern technologies to handle adverse conditions made accidents in snowy and icy areas even more severe, as evidenced by the state of the car, which likely lost control on a slippery road. On February 7, 2014, the Los Angeles Fire Department responded to an accident involving a pedestrian hit by a car, which left 4 people injured and 3 cars damaged, including a 1947 Chevrolet Fleetline. The collision caused significant damage to the vehicles, with the Chevrolet Fleetline, a classic model, likely being one of the most affected. A truck collided with a garage located on an upper floor of a building in East Cambridge in 1938. Incidents like this were rare, especially in elevated structures, but urban growth and the increase of heavy vehicles in commercial and residential areas raised risks in parking lots and multi-story structures. This group of men stayed by a destroyed automobile, closely inspecting the damage. Around 1932, car accidents were major events, and curious onlookers often gathered to see the damaged vehicles up close. A 7-ton truck was swallowed by a crater that formed in the ground behind the Lobster House. The crater, likely caused by a soil collapse or structural failure, made the truck sink, resulting in severe damage to the vehicle.